Let us now move on our second speaker, Marla Stone, who we thank, first of all, for the conception and organization of this important conference. It is really difficult to summarize Marla's CV and research, especially for me. Her works have taught us a new way of approaching the relationship between art, politics, and the state in the 20th century. She has addressed several topics in European history, including Italian fascist cultural politics, anti-communism, the contemporary far right in Europe, Italian Holocaust memories. She has also published in the field of genocide studies. Among her many publications, I would like to mention The Patron State, Culture and Politics in Fascist Italy, also published in 1992, and her forthcoming book, The Enemy, The Politics and Propaganda of Italian Anti-Communism. I would also like to mention Marla's commitment to human rights and civil liberties. Since 2020, she has been the board president of the American Civil Liberties Union Foundation, Southern California. Today, she will speak about the name and the faces of the enemy as a mobilization for fascist political violence, 1919-1922. It is with great pleasure that I give her the floor.
Thank you, Maddalena. We did a little switcheroo because so many of the themes I'm about to talk about mirror and build on and draw from what Simon just said. So it made a lot of sense to do one switch in this panel. I'm going to adjust this a little bit. In October 1922, the Italian fascist movement became the first anti-socialist and anti-communist political force whose violent crusade against the left led directly to its attainment of national power. Through a violent mobilization against its internal political enemies, the fascist movement appeared to many to have solved the dual problem of a weak, ineffectual liberal institutions and a mobilized, radicalized, and politicized working class. When Benito Mussolini addressed the crowd at what would become Italian fascism's founding meeting in Milan on March 23, 1919, he declared war on socialism. With this, he committed the movement, and later the regime, to a battle that it would fight till its dying days. From the very start, fascism defined itself in opposition to its political enemies. Enemies it declared existential threats to the survival of the nation. Anti-socialism and, after the founding of the Italian Communist Party, anti-communism held a central tactical and philosophical place in fascist ideology and politics, giving it, as Simon just explained, giving it an enemy to purge and a worldview to destroy. Mussolini and the fascist movement he founded saw socialism and communism as threats to the continued existence of the nation and as a brutal material antagonist to fascism's spiritual revolution. Camillo Pellizzi, a leading fascist intellectual, put it, fascism, in contrast to socialism, believed in the absolute superiority of spiritual values, the need for hierarchy. It condemned the idolatry of the masses and denied any value to an economic vision of society. Now, of course, the fascist crusade against its existential enemy is only one example of a diffused phenomenon that I think has come up in so many of the discussions so far and will continue to come up, which is the existence of an existential political enemy. In fact, a glance at modern history proves the centrality of political, social, and racial enemies. One need only look, we could think of a million examples, but one need only look at British World War I propaganda denigrating the Hun, or depictions of Islamic terrorists in American political and popular culture post 9/11. To see that the specter of a barbaric and civilization-destroying enemy and the fears it engenders are staples of contemporary political life. Largely instigated by the work of controversial right-wing thinkers like Carl Schmitt and Leo Strauss, historians and political scientists have turned increasingly in recent years to the role played by the declaration of enemies in political polarization and political violence. Schmitt and Strauss considered campaigns against racial and political enemies definitional not only to dictatorships, but to democracies as well. Arguing for a friend-enemy binary, Schmitt, the infamous Nazi theoretician of enmity, Schmitt proposed that the capacity to expel an existential enemy from the body politic determined national health. And he proposed that such a crusade could provide essential glue in fragmented modern societies. So with all of that in mind, my talk today details some of the narratives and imageries of fascist anti-socialism and anti-communism, and the way they motivated violence in the early years of the fascist movement and the first years of the regime. Okay. And I'm dividing my talk into sort of these categories. The propaganda war that accompanied the war on the ground came from above in the form of speeches and pronouncements of fascist leaders and publications in the fascist press, as well as from below in the form of squadrist culture, the songs, the memoirs, the first-hand accounts produced by rank-and-file black shirts. And it also came from visual culture, sometimes produced outside of any official structures. A visual and discursive imaginary of civilization-destroying enemies gave meaning to early fascism, motivated its fighters, comforted its adherents, and it rationalized the squadrist bloodthirst. Perhaps most importantly, these enemies were an other whose purge would allow for national regeneration, as Simon also talked about. Fascist anti-communism and anti-socialism operated from a series of binaries: national versus foreign, civilized versus barbaric, moral versus immoral, and later, Catholic versus godless. The enemy, said the fascists, represented threats to our way of life, and this enemy was destined to sow disorder and chaos. Moreover, argued the fascists, socialism and communism broke down the social and moral order, leading to gender inversion, creating effete men and masculine women, and thereby unnatural social and sexual relations. With these binaries in mind, depictions of fascism's early enemies in its earliest phase carried three primary characteristics, which I have on this slide. First, the idea that they were shirkers, cowards, traitors, imboscati, the people that hide in the woods, who had abandoned the home front and thus the nation during World War I, and who get blamed for Italy's losses in World War I. Second, that they were constructed by the squadrists, by early fascism, as the anti-nation to fascism's representation as the nation. And then a third element was this emerging, increasingly important idea that the enemy was non-human, and there was a sort of use of disease metaphors and depictions for the enemy. Okay, so in the course of destroying the opposition, early fascists began the process of naming the enemy, of separating it from ordinary Italians, of establishing boundaries around who is in the national community and who is not. Naming and then separating is essential to the politics of enemies as preparation for violence against them. So as I said, the fascists labeled their foes in ways that moved them out of the realm of normal political conflict, right? They were weak, they were cowards, they were shirkers, they hid in the woods. And here we have an example of a song about how the fascists would go to war and the weak, the imboscati, would hide at home and hang out in cafes. Fascist press coverage, leaflets, songs, and speeches devised a series of names to refer to their enemies on the left, to mark them as other and dangerous. So they were not called socialists and communists in official press. They were called sovversivi, imboscati, leninizzati, and always rossi, right? The Reds. These names became signifiers of all that fascism was not, and these same names would be transferred seamlessly in the 30s when fascism went to war in Spain and global communism became the enemy. These same names were used for the external enemy. So this mechanism of creating an existential internal enemy, and then in the 30s, an existential external enemy. In the early years, fascists violently pursued socialists and their institutions, claiming this was due punishment for their cowardice and abandonment of the nation. In an Italian version of stab in the back myth, so crucial to Weimar politics and the rise of the Nazis, it was socialist perfidy that led to Italian defeats against Austria. So for the squadrous fighters, the attacks on socialist leaders and institutions was merely justified revenge. So, as I said, imboscati, those who hide, was a particular epithet for rationalizing and celebrating fascist violence. The idea that they didn't fight like men, that they would either hide in the urban center or they would hide in the woods, and they were weak and corrupt, and they didn't fight fair. This discourse quickly established a gendered binary of the manly defense of the nation versus the feminine cowardice of socialist deserters and ambushers. So here we have a postcard from 1922, and we saw postcards in the last presentation. Postcards were a very popular way of spreading these images. So here we have a black shirt with his manganello, his club, the favored weapon of the fascists, standing on the smoldering ruins of a socialist Casa del Popolo or a union hall that he's just destroyed. We see the defiled red flag at his feet. This image signaled to supporters that the threat had been destroyed and order had been restored while celebrating the violence of the fascist squad. And his proud masculine stance versus the ruined hall and the destroyed flag again signal and represent fascist dominance over its enemies. So while the squadristi drove into battle in open Fiat trucks, the Reds ambushed. They fought from behind closed windows, hidden in hedges, as one of the squadrists who led the violence in the province of Siena, Giorgio Chiurco, wrote in his memoir, and memoirs of these battles were a very popular genre. He wrote, "The socialists fire as usual from behind shutters and doorways." Giuseppe Bottai, a leading fascist figure, later governor of Rome and minister of education, echoed this sentiment in his memoir, "The subversives fire from behind the safety of curtained windows." Hagiographies of fascist martyrs, as we just heard about, often painted a picture of the heroic black shirt, head high, marching openly, and then attacked in an ambush and left to die on the road. Rationale for violence against the socialists included the idea that they were not only weak and hiding, but they would attack veterans, right? So they were unpatriotic and un-Italian. In another sort of black shirt memoir, Francesco Di Pretorio wrote, "The fascists were driven by the same holy faith consecrated by our martyrs and heroes. The socialist enemies of the nation," Di Pretorio wrote, "had spat on the survivors, the wounded, the invalids, and the veterans of the First World War." Okay. And here we have a sort of lighter image, but I think in a way makes light of and almost humor of fascist violence, right? This is by Adolfo Busi. We see the sort of child, black shirt, trampling on the flag, and he has his club, and then he's defending Italy, represented by the little girl. And just to make the point about how these images are produced outside of official channels, Busi was a producer of sort of Hallmark cards, of sort of entertaining cards. Here's sort of his more typical production from 1922. This shows the diffusion and popularity, I think, of these images. Okay, so connected to the enemy's weakness and cowardice was the fascist argument that socialism and its internationalism represented the end of the nation and the end of the process of nation building that had begun with the Risorgimento. This element of fascist anti-socialism and anti-communism was connected to anxieties over the weaknesses and failure of the post-Risorgimento state. For the fascists, the Reds represented a defilement and desecration of the nation. So by saving the nation, the fascists proposed to keep whole that which the socialists had fragmented. The fascist movement channeled long-standing anxiety over Italian national identity by calling on Italians to recreate the state on the basis of the defeated socialist and communist enemy. In this way, fascism tapped into Italy's movement of national identification, national unification in the 19th century that had rallied residents of the Italian peninsula through a call to expel the foreign occupier. So thus, the failure of Italian nationalization from the Risorgimento forward begins in which the nation is defined against an enemy. And this paves the way for the binaries of the 20th century. The nation, anti-nation binary was frequently signified by destroyed or burned red flags versus aloft or intact Italian flags. I'm actually going to come back to this card in a minute and focus on this one. Here's a postcard from 1923 that makes that point. This is for the political elections. The Fascist Party issued a series of before and after postcards. So before and after is a good format for representing the friend-enemy binary. We have 1919, Bolshevism, and the socialists are marked by their red scarves and their red flag. The Bolshevik men are oblivious to the suffering of the mother and child. We come back to the mother and child theme here as they wreak chaos and disorder, indicated by sort of the burning buildings, but also indicated by their sort of disheveled clothing, and then the sort of woman and child suffering, implying the sort of destruction imposed by the left. And we go to the after, where women are wearing traditional clothes, their hair is covered. Think about the loose hair in the first part. Their hair is covered. And then in the first panel, both men and women are together, and then in the second one, there's a kind of gender separation and a focus on productivity and work. Another slide from the same series, showing a kind of red tide that had caused the lira to lose its value and the economy to crash. This crowd is again disheveled and shouting. It's mixed in terms of gender, as opposed to the 1923 side of the slide, the post-March on Rome side, which shows an orderly, all-male, black-shirted army marching with an Italian national flag. So the conflation of the fascist call with the national call. And then I want to go back to the castor oil cure. This is a particularly interesting postcard where we see the transition from the socialist waving the red flag. He looks sort of dangerous and chaotic. He's trampling the national flag, and then the fascist is running to sort of purge him and fix him, and he's given castor oil, and then he is repented and is allowed to join the national community. And a really interesting point is, in this period, there was redemption possible. When we get to the 30s and the enemy becomes racialized, a biological enemy, and being a communist inheres in the body, this kind of redemption is no longer possible. This is an image from later, from the 30s, but again, the idea of things being represented by flags standing in for bodies, and the black, I think this will remind people of El Lissitzky's paintings around the Russian Revolution, where the black wedge is pushing down the red flags and the red tie. The black shirts stand between, this is about the burning of the Avanti building, and here we have the black shirts standing between the flames they have set and the mass or tide of mobilized socialists. Now, finally, in the last years of the fascists, during the fascist regime, there is a transformation in its conception of the enemy. And the enemy becomes increasingly depicted through animal metaphors, disease metaphors, sort of depicted as a monster, as a racialized monster. Here's a postcard from the war called Europe Against Anti-Europe. So the fascist forces are shutting the door on this sort of devil figure that now represents the communist and the external communist enemy, Europe against anti-Europe. I don't have a lot of time to elaborate on this element, but this starts early, hints of this. Mussolini says in his 1927 memoir, he refers to the Biennio Rosso of 1919 and 1920 as a period in which the bacteria of socialism emerges, and that if it's not treated heroically, it will be deadly for the life of a civilized nation. So these three imperatives, the idea that the enemy is weak, has betrayed the nation in its time of need, the idea that the enemy represents all that the nation is not, and the conflation of the fascist cult and the national cult, and then finally the increasingly non-human depictions of the enemy, rationalized fascist violence, becomes central to fascist identity after this assumption of power, and then becomes central to arguments about why the regime needs to go to war against global communism, and then why on the home front people need to be afraid of the Soviet enemy. And this gets ramped up into a really life or death struggle by the time of the war. This is a poster from the Republic of Salo, going back to that theme about mothers and children, the gendered theme. This is actually put out during the Nazi occupation of Italy, and it is, children being stolen from their mothers. The rumor that went around in this period was that if the Red Army and the Allies won, children would be taken from their mothers and sent to forced labor camps. So we have the figure in the back is this sort of very biological, demonic depiction of a soldier in the Red Army, and then this kind of feminized British soldier. But the idea being to prey on people's deep, visceral fears of the stealing of children, and then the weird displacement here, because the actual taking of children to labor camps is happening on the Axis side, right? So this is weird projection. And then I want to say, as kind of a postscript, the power of anti-communism and anti-socialism and the way this defines the 20th century, even when there are no viable communist movements. So to bring it up to the present day, this is a T-shirt. I did election monitoring in Arizona for the last U.S. presidential election, and this woman came up to cast her vote, and she was very proud of her T-shirt, which you can see says, "Only you can stop socialism, vote Trump 2020. This is an image from a Trump rally in October 2020 with Trump as Braveheart and the head of Karl Marx. I think we could agree this is kind of a rationale, a mobilization for political violence. And then coming back to the thing of things being produced outside the boundaries of a campaign or a party, this was being sold on the internet with the MAGA fist smashing the hammer and sickle. So the idea of anti-communism without communists and the need for an existential enemy, even when that enemy is not particularly present. So thank you.